we're going to have a great morning. We've got Nigel Farage, who so generously has given up his time to be here, and he's going to explain Brexit to us, because down here, Nigel, we're very confused exactly what it is and what it...
We have done something thought to be more impossible than building a wind farm that didn't need government subsidies. We've created a print magazine in the 21st century which makes a profit. What has brought this on is the prospects of a different kind of Anglo-Australian relationship post-Brexit. Though we understand that the EU has made it clear that there can be no trade deal if Australia resiles from the Paris Climate Accords agreement. Alcohol consumption in Australia is now at a 55-year low. I mean, what are you doing?
I needed a break. I just couldn't put up with it anymore. Constant political warfare, voter disenchantment, internecine battles going on within the parties, talk of leadership changes. It was all too much. So I thought I'd come to Australia. So, very quick history lesson. 1870, a newly formed Germany invades west across the Rhine. 1914, Germany invades westward across the Rhine. There's a pattern developing here. And the European Union came about out of the desire to stop that from ever happening again. They were the founding aims of the European project. In a way, the same kind of high-minded ideals, I guess, that the communists had 50 years before them. Not that that worked out terribly well, did it? There were the never-ending stories of Stuart Wheeler taking Tory MPs out to lunch. And the story was that a lot of Tory MPs were on the verge. They'd had enough of Cameron's European policy. A lot of Tory MPs were on the verge of defecting to UKIP. I did nothing to dampen down any of this speculation. I said, she's the worst Prime Minister in our lifetimes. He said, steady on, old boy, there's a bit of competition out there. Anybody, Andrew, going into a business negotiation, it's quite simple, isn't it? The other side needs to know, if we're in a business negotiation, that if I'm not satisfied with what you're giving me, I'm getting up, I'm walking out of the room, and I'm taking my business with me. No deal is better than a bad deal was a phrase that I coined with Economists for Brexit with 2 weeks to go before the referendum. They owe us money, we're shareholders, we've pumped hundreds of billions into this.
So let me get, so you wouldn't pay a penny?
The only ongoing liability that we've got would be on issues like pensions, but you're talking about very small sums of money there.
Right.
Let's say we reject the deal, does that mean we stay or leave? Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? What would the question be? Very, very difficult problem. What would the question be? I mean,
is there an implicit threat in that?
A complete breakdown of trust in our current established political system and our mainstream political parties, and I think...
Well, you mean unlike now?
I think it'd be a lot worse. Be a lot worse, and I think we may well see, as a result of it, and it may not be a bad thing, but we may see the established political order of Labour and Conservative parties actually broken apart by a second referendum. Some kind of realignment of British politics, I think, would come from it. And what she wants to do is to sign us up to full regulatory alignment, or a common rule book is now the terminology they're using. And if we do that, that massively reduces our flexibility and adaptability on the world stage. Only 12% of the UK economy is exporting goods to the European Union. And yet, to be part of a single market or the new framework that Mrs May is proposing, the other 88% of our economy is bound by European rules. I want us to, and you never hear this word in politics anymore, I want us to become competitive.
You can talk about free market capitalism and deregulation as implying that in some kind of post-Brexit nirvana, Britain will become a sort of Singapore West, while Mr. Corbyn dreams of a Cuba East. It is
or Venezuela.
I think that ship sailed the harbour. That's what Aaron Banks thinks.
Yeah. Well, he's wrong. Here's the argument. The argument is you can negotiate from within the European Union. You know, why don't, oh, Nigel, we don't need to leave the EU, let's just try and reform it. We tried 43 years of reforming it, we got nowhere. To be honest with you, I'm going back on the road, right. I'm going back to campaign for Brexit. I want it delivered.
What's the campaign?
I'm going back out there on the road to make these arguments, to try and mobilise people, to frankly put the fear of God into these MPs. And as I've been forced, Andrew, to go back on the road and do this again, the one little promise I make is this time, from me, no more Mr. Nice Guy. We and our friends like Australia fought 2 world wars, shed much blood and treasure, so that we and the rest of Europe could be free, independent nations. I think reminding people of facts like that is very, very important. I do. I absolutely do. Well, certainly I'd like the wine at 0 tariff. Now, there's a good place to start.
But it seems to me it's much more simple for the average Chinese to migrate to Australia than it is for the average Scot, for example.
Yeah, I mean...
That's understandable, isn't it, really? I mean, you'd definitely want the Chinese before you'd want the Scots, wouldn't you?
Well, yes, probably.
And let me begin by saying that but for Britain, modern Australia would not exist. While it's not fashionable, hasn't been fashionable for years, to remember our debt to Britain, it's worth reminding ourselves at a gathering such as this that no less an Australian than John Curtin himself, he of Australia Looks to America, also said just a couple of years later that no country on earth corresponds more closely to this one than the motherland.
Well, I don't think there would be pushback here. I don't think that Australian farmers would be scared of British farmers. I don't think Australian bankers would be scared of British bankers. I'm not saying that an unemployed, Glaswegian skinhead should think that he can just come and be unemployed at Bondi. I'm not thinking that at all. But if someone who's a shipbuilder for British Aerospace wants to come and work in Australia
And gets a work contract.
and gets a good, well-paid job where he or she is not displacing someone else, and if it's a well-paid job, almost certainly that's not the case, why not let it happen? When I suggested to someone in the government the day after Brexit that there should now be an immediate embrace of an urgent free trade agreement with Britain, there was a little bit of pushback because this individual said, but won't that make it harder to get a free trade deal with the EU? To which my response was, you will never get a free trade deal with the EU, never. My understanding is that the EU is trying to do a deal with America, even though Donald Trump has pulled out of Paris. So double standards are the one thing up with which we will not put. And as for the so-called divorce bill, well, all of the EU's obligations in Britain, all of the EU's property in Britain, we will take, and all of the EU's obligations in Europe and all of the EU's property in Europe, you can take. Thank you, we are walking away. Neil, as you well know from your constitutional studies, that constitutional arrangements and conventions in countries such as ours are constantly evolving.
It's been said, Steve, that an EU deal, Tony Abbott just said, cannot be done. Cannot be done. You can't herd all these cats. It's never going to happen.
Well, I'm more optimistic. I don't know if Tony's still here. I'm more optimistic than Tony. Maybe it's because I've got vowels at the end of my surname, I'm not sure. But I always say I'm from the...
My family members do too.
Ironically, you had more of a problem than I did, Matt. But
I am, of course, delighted that Britain voted to leave the European Union. And I was glad that Andrew reminded the audience this morning of the massive tariff barriers which are faced by Australian wine exporters. And I can make a political observation. The problem that the British Prime Minister faces at the moment is that she has lost her authority because she almost lost power in an election that was sadly not well handled. I wish her well. She belongs to the same broad political tribe as I belong to. I have an even greater incentive to see a Conservative government remain in power because of the absolutely abominable toleration of anti-Semitism in the ranks of the British Labor Party. I thought the days of large defence acquisitions by Australia from Britain were well and truly over. And it is a great thing, and I'm sure it's a very expensive export, as Andrew said. I hope it's a good export, can I say. Hang the expense if it's good, although I look and see John Stone, and he always winced whenever I said hang the expense. You know? I was first elected to Parliament in 1974, and at that particular time there was a lot of concern about the stranglehold of American foreign investment on our domestic car industry. People said, isn't it terrible Detroit has so much say? We would have gone down on our bended knees a few years ago to keep Detroit heavily invested in the Australian motor car industry, but of course for the obvious of economic reasons, once prohibitive tariffs were removed, that changed. So we have to always welcome foreign investment. We shouldn't adopt a completely tickle-my-tummy attitude to it, but we should nonetheless be ready. The most important commodity anybody has in leading a government is authority. It's not popularity. Your popularity fluctuates. So I can speak from experience. It does. It goes up and down. Those who want to have another referendum should be careful of what they wish for, because it might end up being even more resounding. But then I could be completely wrong.
Interesting you mentioned Mr. Toombs. He's Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. He's done a wonderful book on the history of England, not Britain, history of England, and is a regular contributor to The Spectator.
Can I mention that book was voted the best book in 2014, even by The Guardian?
Traditions that make Australia Australia are British traditions, and they are under increasing attack. A quarter of our population was not born in Australia, many of them coming from countries where the democratic traditions that make Australia what it is are not recognised, not acknowledged, and not defended.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming along today, to the senators and, of course, John Howard.